we've gone through this journey ourselves here. You're dealing with challenges and how the technology has to improve in order for those things to become a reality, right? We definitely had to take these 2.5 approaches. And we thought, okay, if we can make it 2 to 3 clicks, you're on and you're a part of the system, that's a win. And so we did that, right? And we got over 10 million users to opt into Brave Rewards and start to be a player in the system. You have to figure out ways to reduce that cognitive load for users, because the reality is you're not just making something new with Web3, you're making something that has to compete with big tech on incumbent Web2 spaces.
Welcome to another episode of the Untangling Web3 podcast. Today, we're thrilled to have Luke Mulks joining us on the show. Luke is Vice President of Business Operations at Brave Software, where he champions Brave's mission to build a user-first web. In this episode, we'll be talking to Luke about the idea of Web 2.5, the transition phase between the old internet and the new, as well as some of the practical ways that the team behind the Brave browser are looking to integrate Web3 technologies into existing internet infrastructure. Luke, it's a huge pleasure to welcome you to the show.
Thanks for having me on. Been looking forward to this.
Hey, Luke, how are you doing today?
Doing well.
Great to hear. So Jack gave a little bit of an introduction there to you, and I am really excited for this episode to find out more about Brave. We use the term Web 2.5 a lot, so it'd be good to get your insight into what that actually means for the space. But, before we get there, could you tell us a little bit about your early career and background before we go into what led you into Web 3 and Web 2.5 and all these things?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of started off in the media production side of things. I worked for publishing companies and then founded some startups and crashed and burned some startups and wound up after about an 8-year journey of bringing, when I was in publishing, we were bringing everything digital. So this was back in 2003 to 2011 roughly. And so everything had been on film and transparencies, and even the printing process was all done very analog. And so I was there at that stage when they were cutting that over into digital, which was super interesting too, especially with AI and things like that, where it's kind of like the next phase of that. But anyway, crashed and burned some stuff there. And then I ended up in ad tech, where I worked really in the middle of everything. So we worked for this company, OAO. We had clients that were like NBC, Google. We were a Google reseller for Google Ads, and then for all their publisher stuff too as well. And then we worked with like NBC, NFL, a lot of the major media companies, Warner Brothers, etc. And so what we did there was basically hooked up all the ad products and advertising for them to monetize, because these developers, they love developing their apps. They don't really care about the money, even though it's what kind of powers everything. So our company came in and we're like, cool, we know how all this stuff works. And so we plugged it all together. But it gave me a really interesting vantage point, because we were a small company, so we could be really agile, but you were really in the mix of everything. And it was right when advertising used to be like at the site level. So you go buy ads on a property, then whoever's there sees them and they quasi-personalize them. But I got into advertising as Google and Facebook started to really drill down into programmatic advertising and take more and more market share. And so you saw this whole consolidation of the advertising space, and then that focus went away from targeting websites and people that visit websites to just targeting big herds of people, to then targeting very specific people, right? And then that's where I was, okay, I'm not really I did that for several 6 years, and then I was like, okay, what's the next thing that I want to do? Because I wasn't really happy with how being a part of that whole apparatus, and there really wasn't any alternative. But I told myself, if there was a startup I wanted to go back into, I wanted to make sure it was something I really cared about, with a team and that I really cared about, and for a cause I was really cared about. And so I stumbled into Brave at that point, where I saw what they were doing. This was back in early 2016, so January, February. And I saw they had this really interesting proof of concept that they were working on that involved paying creators Bitcoin in the browser, and that they were really trying to do a bunch of advertising related things. But the challenge with them was that they blocked all the ads and tracking that were part of Web 2, right? So there's good reasons for that, right? But the problems with doing that is that's also how they account for everything, is through the tracking, right? So I reached out to them back then in March of 2016 and started working with Brave. I think there were maybe 10 or 11 people at the company at the time. And then, we came on full time and then started working on the white paper for BAT with the team. And then we brought that to market. But that's the genesis of the journey. There was really nobody these problems that Brave had been trying to solve, especially back then, like 2016, there weren't anybody like other companies trying to solve them because everything was like so plug and play. And when you're plugging and playing into like kind of the user hostile defaults, like there's not a lot of incentives to do something else, especially back then, because like things like GDPR and like privacy regulations weren't really, they didn't have any traction back then. And so people looked at me kind of weird when I said, hey, yeah, we're going to go try and make advertising work without tracking.
So, I mean, that's really exciting to know. And we're definitely going to go into Brave and everything you're doing there later in the show. But it's really good to know that you were kind of in and around Web 1, Web 2 with all these problems, especially in the ad space, right? The ad space for the internet has been both the fuel for the industry, but also some of the problems that I'd like to go into right now. You're very familiar with Web 2 and the Web 2 challenges that exist today. But what do you see as some of the major challenges with the internet right now?
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of challenges around the advertising model and user tracking and privacy. Like those are still big challenges, but there's actually been progress there, which is interesting too, because this year Google finally said we're going to kill third-party cookies in Chrome, which is like a long time coming. Like that was like they've been kicking the can down the road on that for years. And so this is where it's exciting for us, is because with everything that's happened on the regulation side too, like with GDPR and driving everybody crazy with cookie consent notices, which are probably like there's a lot of like mixed bags with these, types of regulations, because in some respects, like the great thing about having something like GDPR is that you actually have a definition for what user data means, because in the US, you're basically like privacy is basically whatever either lawmakers decide, which they are really slow and don't move quickly on, or it's what companies dictate privacy means, right? Because that's where a lot of the conversation happens. And so in Europe, when you have a standard there, like with what the regulation says, no, this is actually user data is this really black and white thing. It helps to set the tone enforce because of forcing function everywhere else. And so those challenges are still big. I think that a mix of things are happening right now where you have marketers that don't really know exactly what the world looks like when you get rid of third-party cookies, because they're such a huge part of like programmatic advertising and tracking and audience segmentation and all those things work. But then on the other end of the spectrum too, like Web3 is still not at a place where you can go get your neighbor to use it, your relatives to use it super easily. And that's where we're trying to help out with things too, being folks that really care about this. Like it's in our DNA here at Brave, like all this Web3 technology, but also just the usability of things. And so I think those are the big challenges, like especially in the Web3 space too. I've been in the space for like 8 years, and there's an obsession sometimes with complexity and with the doodads and the airdrops and all these. Oh, it's like a infinite amount of chains, and it's okay. Can I just get one where it's easy for folks to get on and start making the economics work? And so there's a lot of competition in that space right now, but also in some respects, it's looking like that on-ramp might take longer than folks anticipated, which is kind of frustrating. That said, there's a lot of things happening in that front that are interesting too, and ways for these two things to converge too, which you're super interested in, because if you have this really nice like symbiosis of, okay, we have to get rid of third-party cookies, but like things like NFTs or other types of crypto technology are becoming more and more popular, or actually like usable, and people can relate to them, then you can start to look at things that like, can we start to segment based on like holders and communities, and then work it to brands, because everything can be scaled up into a different context, like with a bigger brand.
Yeah, I really like how you've articulated that. And to be honest, I think you're touching on problems in Web 2 and then also Web 3, because I think the problems in Web 2 are quite concrete. And especially when I try and talk to somebody about why do we need Web 3, people say this is just this term. What does it actually mean? I often start with the problems of Web 2 and say advertising is one of the top ones I talk about. The fact that, as you say, we have these cookies which effectively track our history. When you visit a site, it might log in. There's this cookie that follows you and then links behavior or your browsing activity across different websites. And I think a lot of people understand that problem. People know when they're being advertised to, even that there's all the conspiracies around, is my iPhone recording me? And every time you have a conversation about a pair of new Nikes, then you'll get advertised them immediately. So people are quite conscious of this problem around advertising. And I personally think Web3 is quite well placed to kind of alter that model and provide a different way. But before we get on to the Web3 side of this and the new problems that trying to use Web3 solutions might bring in, as you're alluding to, are there any other problems outside of just advertising in the Web2 world that you think are important to be addressed and could be addressed by Web3?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple things. The advertising problem too is like deeper than just cookies at this point, because there have been companies that have specialized in linking offline and online data too, and some of them have been operating for like decade at this point. And so that part gets even scarier down the rabbit hole the more you go. And that there's companies that people have never even heard of that are doing these things like on a regular basis. But outside of that too, I think we're starting to see things manifest too. Like a couple of cycles ago in crypto, like people would talk about Bitcoin and about Web3 in the abstract of like, well, if something were to happen with one of these big tech companies, then I would be locked out of their system, or I don't have control over my identity, or I don't have control over my content, or I don't have control over this or that. And I think the past 2 years, especially, we've seen a manifestation of situations that kind of lived in the abstract, or scenarios that used to live in the abstract, actually like playing out in the real world, where it didn't matter to initially. It seemed okay, it went from these companies could do this if they wanted to like, no, now YouTube's actively demonetizing everybody that says these magic words. And then it's like, okay, well, one side of the spectrum seems to be getting hit. Now it's like everybody. I mean, if you think about like every podcast or YouTube channel you go to where you hear these hosts that have to self-censor themselves because they might say something that's going to get flagged and then demonetize them. I think that these things are kind of manifesting now. The rubber's meeting the road. Even things like with the trucker protest in Canada, where you start to see things that were like used for like terrorism lobbying used against like protesters to freeze accounts like with funding that protesting. I mean, regardless of the politics of it, the point is that these things are going from the abstract into like the everyday world, where it is starting to affect people at that level.
That kind of, I think exactly, you've hit the nail on the head, is this walled gardens type issue, right? And for many years, people saying these big tech companies, they are walled gardens, they can lock you out, they can stop things. And everyone was like, well, that's not a problem, but it's not a problem until it becomes a problem. I mean, even things like, as you mentioned, YouTube, I've seen a lot of creators struggling with things like copyright striking now, right? Where they're getting, the one that comes to mind, I'm a rugby fan. And during the Rugby World Cup, lots of independent creators were having, completely fair use videos where they've taken, footage from the Rugby World Cup and they've done something with it and they've transformed that content. It should be protected under fair use, but YouTube is still allowing these copyright strikes to go through because they're beholden to the interests of the larger companies, right? That's one of the big issues I think you're getting at here.
Oh, I have a wild anecdote that's on that line too. So we have a partner of ours. This is a company called Karate Combat. They do like UFC types of mixed martial arts. And they were doing a live stream, and I was at the event in Las Vegas in December. They had a live stream and for their app, and then they also had one on YouTube. And somehow, like within seconds, there was a fighter music that was coming on when they do the walk-on appearance. And somehow YouTube knew within 10 seconds of it going on that it was copyrighted, and they flagged and turned off the live stream on YouTube. It was like so quick, and we were in there, and I was standing next to the CTO at the event, and his phone was just blowing up because all these people are like, we have all these streamers they're live streaming it from YouTube, and now it's all YouTube seats down. It was like, I was just impressed though with the fact that like, how did they know? It was a live event. We were there. Like, how do they know it that quickly? There's got to be something in there that's checking these things like really rapidly as they're happening. But it was the next level. Like that one opened my eyes a bit, and that is usually a struggle for me to get surprised like that at this age of my life. But I think it definitely touches on the problem you were mentioning too around the copyright side.
That's incredible. And I think another thing that you were talking about there is the role of these big, say, walled garden Web2 players in terms of, I guess, free speech, right? And I'd be really interested to get your opinion on what do you think their role is? What do you think the role of an X or a Facebook of the world is when it comes to free speech, hate speech? Should they be filtering content, or should they just be a service provider that doesn't touch that kind of stuff?
It's such a messy thing too, and this is the other part, like a Web2 problems manifesting too. Is like you've got these walled gardens, and then you've got these walled gardens that have like very established monetization, and then the forces that are behind those are very consolidated too. So what you're starting to see happening more and more, I mean, not starting to, I mean, it's been happening for a while now, but are like a loose confederation of companies that are all part of these lobbying groups that typically go after politicians, but what they're doing is putting pressure on the platforms, right? When they see somebody they don't like, or somebody talking about something they don't want, they'll get people to brigade the platform or whatever, right? Like, and I think it's a messy situation right now, because from my point of view, like in what Brave tries to do everywhere is have like credible neutrality. So you want to be able to let, as long as it's not promoting violence or something that's going to directly harm somebody, you want to use that First Amendment as a North Star to like model after, where as much as you can. And so you're seeing different platforms use different approaches at this. Like Facebook made a council that tries to approach these things from the industry side. X has taken a very different approach, which I kind of align a lot more on. I think that there's another part of the free speech element too that really applies to Web3 too, because what you're seeing with crypto regulation is a lot of these issues start to boil down with like, how is the US trying to regulate crypto? A lot of it turns into, okay, in a situation where you have a bunch of hosted dApps and things like that are hosted on servers, it breaks down into like a First Amendment issue because of the way that software is published. And like a lot of lawyers, I actually had a guy, Preston Byrne, on my podcast last week. We were talking about this, where if you have something that's locally on your browser or on your client, on your device, that runs on your device, just how it needs to run, doesn't rely on like a hosted server to do it, things fall into free speech territory with as far as the software is concerned, right? So there's this element of like the content creation around free speech and users around free speech, but then there's also this element of like development around free speech. And so what folks are trying to do is say, okay, like, how much of your dApp or how much of your software can you have run locally on the client versus having to run it there? Because if you're running it on a server, there's a chance you might get flagged as like an unregistered broker dealer or something like that, based on the other challenge, like 1930s securities regulation, which is just very hard to work in. You end up with like having a startup in this space is like really wild, because companies have to have so many law firms on tap for different areas, and then it's cheap, not cheap at all. It's really expensive, and you see where the barriers of entry are all playing out too on that side. So I mean, I think that plays into usability big time too.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Like, we started this as a technology first podcast, but so often the Web3 dilemma and debate and philosophy, gets into philosophy, right? It's such a philosophical point to all this stuff, and it borders into legality. And it's not just about the tech anymore. It's also about how it affects individuals, how it affects rights, and how governments are starting to regulate and understand that. And I think on that point, we've talked a little bit so far about the challenges in Web2. And I guess then they present the opportunities for Web3. So tell us about Brave. Tell us about what the journey is, what problem it's trying to solve, and how it's solving it.
Yeah, sure. So I think this leads in very well from what you were just talking about around. I think if this technology wasn't important, it wouldn't boil down to the philosophy so often, right? Because this is where it's like super powerful technology. Because when you break it down, like what we're really trying to do here at Brave is we say user first a lot. And what that really means is you're building software and tools that prioritize the interest of the user first, right? So that means that the user's privacy is protected by default. That means that the user can give data to whoever they want. They just have to be the one to do it. And you have to like prompt them to do it. And this isn't like cookie consent notices or things like that are super annoying. It's more about just like building to fundamentally respect people. And our thesis on this initially, and what really got me over to Brave initially back in 2016, was the fact that they were the only people I was seeing that were saying like, look, you don't have to subvert users' decisions, because there were these companies out there that were starting to say, okay, for publishers, we can actually bypass the ad blocker and serve an ad to the user, and it's pennies, but at least you're monetizing something, because it was a big problem that you only had a big hammer to solve. And that hammer was adding an ad blocking extension for the user, right? That just takes the monetization away. And then you had these ad blockers that were like, okay, we can put acceptable ads or whatever in the mix, but that doesn't solve the privacy problem at all, because then they just end up whitelisting tracking. So Google ends up tracking people anyway, right? And so Brave was like, let's just start from zero. Let's start with those conditions where the user is respected and users are put first. And so that means we're going to block any third-party ad and tracking by default in the browser. And users can still go and turn them on if they want. And that's up to them. But you're giving the choice back to the user. And then it started there with the privacy side, and then we started implementing policies internally. All of our stuff's open source too. But basically, anytime we have new code or updates to the code that ship in the browser, we have a really pretty intense like security and privacy review process, because if you want things to be user first, you have to make sure that what you're doing is like living up to a really high security standard. You have to make sure that it's transparent, that you can be audited by the outside. And so we check off all these boxes on the ethos side. But really, if you can put the user first, respect their privacy, there's no reason why business can't live in that environment. I think that people naturally hope that's how things are happening, but then it's not, right? So what we're doing is starting from zero, building business on top of that works, and then trying to get the accounting right and everything right with, okay, well, there's no reason why you can't account for things, right? Like, you should be able to track things. You just have to do it in a way that doesn't identify a single user and then broadcast their information everywhere on every website that they go to, right? And so that's kind of where these approaches, and it ties into what we were talking about around First Amendment earlier, where, okay, like Brave, what we did with the ad model initially was say, okay, look, not only can we try to fix the privacy problem and change the way that ads are served, but we also want to give users the option to where they could actually earn a revenue share on the advertising that they view, because they're a part of the attention economy. Like without them, you have nothing. And so like users have been giving this stuff away without even knowing it, and giving it away is a generous term, right? Like they've really been getting fleeced and tracked without really even knowing it for a really long time. But if we can fix the model the way that it works with privacy, and then we can also give users an opportunity to earn that want it, that's a better model that we positioned, that the internet could start to adopt at a bigger scale. And so you get a bunch of like awesome benefits when you start to care about privacy too, from a software perspective, because you realize how much of the internet web pages are just clogged with just junk, right? Like you go to some, I used to do these benchmark tests where we go to different websites like CNN or other news websites, and you would see, like, if you let it just open up and run without any protection going, like thousands of requests are going out over a matter of minutes, and all of them, almost all of them, have your information in them. And so the weight that puts on your system is pretty severe. The amount of bandwidth that consumes is heavy. And if you start looking outside the US, these things are really important to people, especially bandwidth and device size, because there's only so many resources on a couple-year-old device or whatever. And so we started to build these models that work. We changed the way that advertising would work in a browser. And this is something I work pretty closely on, because it was really inefficient when you look at how ads are served, especially programmatically. You go to a web page, all these things are happening from the page that go back to the cloud where all these servers live. A decision's made up there about what ad to show you, and then an ad is showed you. It's all done based off of like a ton of data that's leaked, but it's all like different profiles of you that are never complete, really. And so what we said is, look, like the browser knows everything about the user locally on the device. Your browser knows your browsing history. The browser knows where you're at. The browser knows all these things. What if we just put the way to match advertising directly in the browser, instead of having it work on the cloud with all these other companies trying to do it for you? Like we actually use that whole corpus of data locally on the client to match the ad. So it's like putting a really smart ad server directly in the browser, and then serve ads, and then don't leak the user's information to anybody. And then use ways like with zero knowledge proofs and reporting to like actually get an accurate accounting to the advertiser, so that they know that they're getting ROI like on their investment for spending money on the platform. And so that's what we did, right? We changed the way that ads work from the browser, and then we started implementing reporting systems that like actually could give you an accurate read without compromising the user.
That's fascinating. There's so many little things that I want to pick up on there. One, I mean,
Sure.
ad revenue sharing. We have to talk about that in more detail. But before we get there, it's the idea of cookies. So most people, when we talk about it at a shallow level, see cookies as a bad thing, right? People are tracking your information. You go into a web page and there's cookies everywhere, and that slows everything down. It means they're tracking everything you do everywhere. That's bad generally. That's what the kind of consensus is. But you get things like remembering login information, personalization, right, shopping carts, session management, all this kind of stuff. So I imagine what you're saying is we're turning cookies off completely. Do you lose all these features? But what you've just inferred from what you said was that actually it's managed locally in the browser. So you still have all those features. The user doesn't see much of a difference. We just don't have this connection between the local browser being connected to something on a server and having that ping back. Is that correct?
It's correct. There's a lot of different contexts with this too. There are types of cookies that are used that are in like first party cookies, like when you go to a website and it tries to save your login information and things like that, like functional cookies, right? That you need to be able to like do the thing that you're going to the website to do. And what's the challenge there for us has been over the years, it's been a huge challenge, to the point where we've actually brought new technology to market to help to break the web as little as possible while still giving really good privacy protection, because brute forcing these things sometimes makes it really hard to, like, what advertising technology started to do as ad blockers got more popular was they started to tie the marketing technology together with the functional technology, so that if you block this thing that the ad needed, it would then block the functional thing on the website. And so what you end up happening is like all these cases where the ad blockers had to like whitelist stuff or whatever. And what we said is, okay, what our research team, this guy, Peace and our super big brain on this stuff, like brought some research papers out where he's, okay, we can put these techniques in that will allow for the user to have their privacy preserved and then not break the web as fundamentally. So like that's been the ongoing challenge too, is that like you've got a brute force approach that people have been using for a long time that works decently well to block a lot of the stuff. But then also as the technology gets more and more, because ad blocking and advertising is an adversarial game. It's a cat and mouse game. It's very Tom and Jerry, where, okay, anybody that goes to Twitch a lot, like, will see this cat and mouse game play out where it's like, oh, I'm not seeing ads, I am seeing ads now. Like, we hear about it all the time. And so a lot of effort goes into making sure that like users are getting what they expect, but also like you're not breaking important things, because if you can't use something that you need to use, you're going to change your browser. Like, we see that happening pretty quickly too. So it's been a balancing act that it took us a long time. Like, our retention has gotten so much better because we put the time into making these things work over time, but it's a challenge, right? Because the industry, like, they don't want to lose money, and yeah, that's how business works too. So I think you're balancing these two things, which kind of collide often, but there's ways you can do it with technology that makes both of them still work.
Yeah, I like that you're describing it as that journey, right? And this is why I wanted to talk about this theme of Web 2.5 in this episode, because you're, as I understand it, and I'm also a Brave user. So my understanding of Brave has always been it was this privacy focused browser first, super fast, privacy preserving, the new way of blocking and handling ads, basically your data in the browser. And then over time, it's developed more and more of these, what we would call Web3 features. So it's gone from just 0 to 1 on improving the Web2 experience and saying, here's the better advertising, here's the better privacy preserving properties you get in a browser. And then you've added the basic attention token for, being rewarded for watching adverts. And then you also have the kind of the creator rewards system, right? So can you go into a little bit more about those two things? Firstly, what the role of the basic attention token is, the BAT token, and then also what the kind of more modern creator royalties and rewards programs are for Brave.
Yeah, sure. So we initially started with Bitcoin in the browser back in 2016 with a proof of concept. And it was really an interesting time because people were looking for different kinds of use cases for it. But at the same time, like, it was when all these big things were happening in Bitcoin around like block sizing and transaction fees. You really started to see, okay, on its own, Bitcoin cannot scale to do what we need it to do here, both like with, okay, you're only making a block every 10 minutes. And the fact that we have something in production now where if somebody wants to contribute $5 to content creators as they browse, they have to put $10 in the machine in order to do it because the fees were expensive when there were a lot more people using it. And so at the time we were looking at options. And like I mentioned at the beginning, we hit this. One of the things when I was really interested in helping on when I came on board was the fact that there's a tricky problem here of blocking the accounting in the process of advertising, right? And so when we saw what Ethereum was doing with the ability to tokenize different use cases, we saw there being a great one with the attention economy. And we really, in order to make things from the original vision work that Brendan or Ike, our creator, had, it was basically, or the co-founder and president of Brave found, it was you got to fix the web, right? And you got to make it commercially viable. And so what we started was like, okay, let's make this use case with advertising because that's the biggest, lowest hanging case that we can do, especially with that. And so we can lean in on getting the privacy right first and then building the business lines in first. Because even back then in 2017, 2016, like, nobody had really solved the problem of how you do these things at scale. But what we were seeing is Ethereum was the place where people were actually like really addressing it seriously. And so we started to say, okay, cool, let's make a token that we can use. And over time, like, initially we'll prove out that users can get a rev share and that creators can get rewarded from users in this platform. But also, like, over time, as the technology improves and gets more scalable, let's put the reporting for the system on chain so that advertisers and creators and the public at large can see an accurate accounting of what we're saying. Because if you think about how advertising works outside of our system, you've got 5 different companies in a lot of cases all tracking one impression because nobody trusts anybody and they're all kind of tracking each other. And so if you can have a public blockchain that you could verify campaign data from, you don't need to have all those different intermediaries that are all collecting data on the user. So that's kind of where it started, is let's use the smart contract model as a way to initially put a token of value out there that users can earn from and creators can earn from, and you can have more transparency and clearer reporting on that's publicly verifiable, because that fits really well with the open source code base that we have, that model, that ethos of, having transparency. And nobody else was really even thinking about this at the time. And so that was the initial thesis. That's what we put in the white paper. And it was initially for advertising, but it really was something where we put this in the white paper too, where there are lots of other attention-based use cases that we can use this token for. And that's been an interesting thing about actually having this in market, is because it's a ERC20 token, we started seeing BAT get picked up by other projects and protocols for use cases we didn't even think about. Like that's time when we made the white paper. So like DeFi came out in 2019, 2020. This is like 2 years roughly after the white paper had come out, where you start seeing people, because they're holding BAT, like they want to put it to work on these different things. So MakerDAO and Compound and a bunch of these DeFi protocols early on started to add BAT and started to play with it in production, which was cool. We're all sitting back with popcorn saying, this is great. Let's see. Hopefully this thing doesn't blow up over here. and then Compound was a big one, where I think they did like, tens of millions of dollars in DeFi testing, basically like in production with their community. And then they ended up upgrading the protocol from what they learned from that. And having BAT involved for those things is cool. But we saw this in like Web3 gaming too, and in other areas with NFTs, et cetera. But back to what you're saying though, initially, the original question, right? Like the earliest cases with this stuff, like bringing people in for ad blocking, right? Like when you're growing a product, like you have to find fit, and you have to find fit at the stage that you're in. And for us, like having these Web3 ethos in the product has always been what we've wanted. Even before people were even using Web3 as a term, we had Bitcoin in, and it was all very much of having a better model. And the thing that people lose sight of is that there's so much noise around scams and garbage in this space that people try to approach it, especially politicians or political leaning people that do or feel threatened or whatever. They'll approach this as like a negative thing, when in reality, like this is a publicly transparent blockchain that works with math and is actually an upgrade to the system. If you have to deal with advertising, you're dealing with different reporting systems for one event that all are 10 to 15% off. There's a discrepancy between all of them. That's all money that you're losing, right? Like if you can have this stuff from a single ledger where you can verify it, and it's verified by a consensus model in the beginning, like that solves a huge problem. And so, yeah, like getting that ad blocking piece initially worked while we built the platform up. And then once we started to launch, we integrated the token into the browser 6 months after we created it on the blockchain, because we had Bitcoin already there. And so we transitioned from Bitcoin into BAT. And that was where you could actually like contribute if you wanted to put it in the system. And what we did was we set aside a pool of tokens when we did the launch, basically for user growth, where we could tap into that and basically say, okay, like we can use this to bootstrap the platform. So we would give people grants of BAT to test out and show creators that, hey, look, you could start to make some income off of this. And if you work with us and grow with us, like we can turn this into a good business line for you.
That's so interesting. I think it's a really interesting story as well. I didn't realize that you'd originally been trying to use Bitcoin. That's really interesting to hear because, I think a lot of people, when you look back at the origins of Bitcoin and it talks about doing these small casual payments like micropayments, to me, Brave has been one of the pioneers in actually putting that model forward. And I'm glad you mentioned Brandon Ike, right? One of the co-founders. Also, for anyone listening, co-founder of Mozilla, creator of JavaScript. So this is an idea that is being backed by some of the biggest people in tech, effectively some of the greatest minds in tech. This whole idea of a creator economy, attention economy, as you put it, that is based on this kind of micropayment system or partial revenues, right? So if you watch an advert, maybe a small piece of it goes to Brave, and that helps you sustain the business as a platform, and a small part can go to the advertiser, and a small part can go to the person watching it. It's a much more equitable model, right? So the next thing I want to ask you then, we've mentioned Web 2.5 this term. I want to ask you, what do you think about that as a piece of terminology? Because as I said, I would probably put Brave on that spectrum. It's very much doing Web3 things, but it's plugging it into existing Web 2 infrastructure into a familiar setting like a browser to help people on that journey. So would you also characterize it as part of Web 2.5 or something else entirely?
Yeah, no, I think the way that you guys are framing it, that's what I was super excited to do this interview too, because we've gone through this journey ourselves here. Like when you've got the first principles that you want with these things, and then you're dealing with challenges and how the technology has to improve in order for those things to become a reality, right? And it required us to very much have a 2.5 approach, because when we first launched this, like I said earlier, like the technology wasn't scalable to do this on chain fully. But also we did our token launch in May of 2017, like the end of May. Regulators hadn't really talked about any of this stuff in a serious way until a few months later, like in July of 2017. And that's where it was like, okay, there was the DAO, one of these DAO guidelines that they put out there, and a bunch of opinions and et cetera around crypto and using it. It was still very unclear, right? But from our perspective, like we have always started by saying, look, we don't want to. Part of the things that makes Brave different from other companies is like companies typically want to start collecting data right away about their users so they can learn, et cetera. Like we don't want to collect any data from our users. We want to collect the minimum amount of anything possible in order for the service to run. Because if something happens, like a government confiscates your servers or you get breached by hackers or whatever, if you have user data on those servers, especially if it's not encrypted, you're putting those users at risk, right? And we want to make sure that we have a situation, like a position of like maximum deniability. So if something does happen, even Brave doesn't use it. Like we treat ourselves as the adversary when we're threat modeling a lot of these problems, because we just want to make sure that this is what sets us apart from a lot of the other players in the space, especially when you see companies like Google and others that start to talk about privacy, where it's like, you guys, the first thing I do is get prompted to sync everything to your guys' servers on all my devices. This is not privacy. It's a different type of privacy you're talking about. From our perspective, we haven't wanted to handle that user's data, but the regulatory situation was so unclear that we decided, okay, let's work with partners that are like exchanges or custodians, that so if users want to take their earnings and take them off, like we can offload to a compliant partner. So in our system, you can opt in, view ads, and basically like in a couple of clicks, be a contributing person in the ecosystem with that if you want. But then if you want to withdraw it, you have to go through a process of linking with a custodian like Uphold or Gemini or Bitflyer in Japan or ZebPay in India. Like, so there's different, we offloaded things at certain points kind of as a 2.5 step, basically, because at the time then too, I mean, go back to 2017, users were using like Mist as a wallet on Ethereum, or they were using like what my Ether wallet. MetaMask started to kind of become popular, but like the tooling was like really crude and hard to learn around self-custody back then. And so basically there were all these different types of problems that needed addressing. And so we put in some pragmatic steps that were like 2.5-ish steps to get them there. Plus, like, a really interesting thing here, and this is really applies to Brave, I think, more than others in the space, because it's not just about the users. Like, we have to be able to make a creator come and use our platform easily. And so since we worked with these creators and publishers in the past, I know that, okay, the process for them adding an ad tag to a page is like not terribly complicated, and it's something that they're familiar with. Can we make a process that works? It's about as easy as that is to get into our system, and then get them hooked up to a custodian so then they can get paid, right, as the second part of that. And so we had to approach these things from these different angles. So like creators, we figured that out, got like 2 million creators to onboard over the course of time. And then the other challenge we had too was on the advertising side, where this platform uses crypto, right? Especially back in 2019 when we launched the ad platform. This stuff was way over advertisers, mainstream businesses' heads. They didn't want to hear about it. They hear crypto and they think lawyers and accountants and more annoying things that nobody has time for, especially when you're a startup and you don't have a ton of scale yet. Because I think when we launched our ad platform, we had about 5 million monthly active users at the time. And so like the numbers were moving up, but they weren't. That's not moving anybody that has to manage time on their calendar during a day. That's not going to get people excited. And so we had to make a system that worked for the advertisers too. So what we did for them was modeled it similar to like how they buy media elsewhere, and then abstract away a lot of the crypto, but make it there if they want. So if you want to pay with that, you can pay with that, or you can pay with other cryptocurrency too, but we don't require it up front because we wouldn't scale the business if we had to, right? So we definitely had to take these 2.5 approaches, and we thought, okay, if we can do this and make it super easy, if we can make it 2 to 3 clicks, you're on and you're a part of the system, that's a win. And so we did that, right? And we got over 10 million users to basically opt into Brave Rewards and start to be a player in the system. And it was one of those things that really stood out too when in the last bull run with crypto, where my neighbors, I don't know if this happens to you guys either, but like each of these cycles picks up, and then I become like this kind of crypto consigliere with everybody in my friends and family and neighborhood that I talk to. And they're all like, okay, at the first one, 2017, 18, they were like, okay, this is a scam. You guys are going to get banned or whatever. And I don't believe in this. And then the next cycle, 2020, 2021, everyone's like, oh, how do I buy? Can you show me how to buy crypto? And I'm like, okay. But what I started hearing from people there was like, I don't understand all these weird use cases, but I totally understand that I use your browser browser, and then I can earn while I'm using your browser, because that fits a lot of like loyalty reward types of programs that are out there. And so they got to be on board. But the other cool thing that started happening is that we'd had users that had been earning in the browser for a long time before the last bull run. And then when things started to move with markets and the values of the token went up and people had been accumulating a lot of BAT throughout, they started to see, oh my gosh, like I've earned hundreds of dollars of value in crypto just from using a browser, which is cool because we do another thing in Brave on our new tab page. Like in the browser, we show you how many ads you blocked, how much time you've saved, estimated, and then how much data you've saved. But then there's this other element where it's like, this is how much I've earned, like over time too, where these are all great growth hacks, by the way. Like if people are trying to look for product market fit, this is kind of how you can do it without having to do an airdrop, is you think of ways to reward retained use of your product, because that's what you really care about. There are vanity metrics out there like, oh, I got this many downloads or this many users or whatever. But what I look at that stuff, sure. But like when I'm looking at the health of a product, I want to know what the daily returning users are, because those are the people that use me every day, right? And those are the people where if I can figure out ways to connect with those people, we can build product that other people will use for sure.
That's a powerful sentence. I really like that. I think you touched on a lot of the challenges to adopting Web3, and I think these are pretty constant across the board. And it's one of the reasons why the Web 2.5 term is becoming so popular. It's just things that me and Jack say all the time. Like you touched on regulatory uncertainty. That's always one of the top ones, right? The biggest one is always user experience. So I've got two questions here. One is, do you think that users are becoming more ready for the full Web3 model because of this, Web 2.5 transition and the increased knowledge and understanding of, crypto assets, for example, and all this kind of stuff? And are there any other challenges you see to the full adoption of a full Web3 paradigm right now outside of regulatory certainty and user experience?
That's a really good question. I mean, because we saw these things manifest a bit in the last bull run where Jimmy Fallon and all these fucking big names started to promote NFT projects, basically. I don't know if they would like me saying promote, but you guys get it, right? But or like Eminem or Snoop Dogg or whatever with Bored Apes and things like that. But I think that it was great to see a lot more people show interest at that time. But I think that what we saw were the cracks too, big time, right? Like I used to deal with a lot of frontline support when this was happening, where because you had all these people flocking to the blockchains, it led to more congestion in the middle of a bull run, which is going to see DeFi, all these other use cases are congesting the network too. And one of the most painful things of it was sitting there getting feedback from people like, look, I didn't know about gas fees. Like I didn't know, like it's costing me more to make the transaction than it is for the thing I'm transacting for, which is a huge problem, right? And the thing that's been really difficult as somebody that's been in this space for a long time is seeing how low a priority that's been, or how much it's been hand waved, I guess I would say, because people will come and say things like, oh, we're going to abstract all of that. We'll make all of these L2s, but then we're going to abstract it away with account abstraction. It's going to be great. You're not even going to know you're on there. That's like talk. Like those are hard things to do. And I think that's the thing that the space totally ignores, is just how hard it is. The mortality rate for a startup is like 90%, right? Over the first 5 years, you have a 90% chance of failing a startup, right? That's before you throw Web3 into it. When you throw Web3 into it, the barriers are even higher, right? Like you have to figure out ways to reduce that cognitive load for users, because the reality is you're not just making something new with Web3, you're making something that has to compete with big tech on incumbent Web 2 spaces, where they're figuring out ways for you to go to a checkout line at Whole Foods and pay with your palm at the register. They're trying to think about things of like, how do I remove the need to even take a wallet out of my purse to buy groceries, which is like a level of convenience that you have to compete against, which if you take that to Web3 developers, they just don't know how to handle it. They could lose their mind. Like they don't, which is fine. They don't need to figure those problems out. But my point is that if there isn't a big effort around this, and this is why the 2.5 stuff I think is useful, if there isn't a big effort around bridging the gap here and making things competitive, like against commercially Web 2 things, then this is never going to get beyond a science experiment or a science project, where maybe we got like 10s or 20,000 daily active users that are all Web 3 people, but we never were able to get those bigger players on that can get us that breakthrough into bigger mainstream audiences. And so I think that's a big usability. It's like such a huge thing that we're finally now at this phase able to start to put things together for broader adoption, which the timing of this interview is like really interesting because last week we announced something pretty big around this. But I think that from our perspective at Brave too, getting the problems we were trying to solve with the token initially were big enough that we could really focus on the privacy side and then work in the Web3 pieces. As long as we're driving the principles of those things, where it's like users getting rewarded, creators having an alternative, build those pieces in with 2.5, and then get to where we are now, where, okay, now there are options for the technology where we can start to do things on chain. And now we can actually start to take it to that next level on the Web3 side. That's where we're at now. It's taken 8 years to get here. And it's not even clean or pretty right now. Like, it's really ugly right now, right? Like, there's stuff that we're having to do to really try to make this work that aren't great. But I think that'll come with time too. And I think that AI hitting the scene now, and in the ways that crypto can help address some of the concerns around AI with identity and proofs of authentication and authenticity and all these types of things, like, it's just going to help to make that adoption more easy for developers and software creators and content creators and everybody, right? But yeah, you have to have the 2.5. And from us, what we've done is we've figured out, okay, here's a really great way to get millions of users, millions of creators, and to get mainstream advertisers to buy into a Web3 based system. Here's what the next phase of this, if we're being serious, and what really I mentioned earlier, how we started having these abstract scenarios come into manifesting themselves in reality with big tech and regulators, et cetera. When we saw things happening, we introduced like a self-custodial wallet into the browser, because like self-custody is one of those user first things that you need to, if you're building for users, like self-custody is a critical part of that, because you're controlling your own destiny basically by having self-custody. And so if we had a model that we could get millions of users to use that was with our token, if we can apply the learnings that we have from getting those millions of users to do that system into something like self-custody, 90% of browser users are making e-commerce purchases in a browser. So if we can start to build those things out, that's where we see ourselves as being a real player here in bridging that gap. It's not going to be to 1 billion users overnight, but it needs to be millions to tens of millions to hundreds of millions, right? And so I think that we're at that phase now where, okay, cool, like we can plug Solana in and we have a multi-chain wallet. So we're not saying one blockchain over another. It's like making these things accessible is key, because there's regional things, like some blockchains are used in different parts of the world compared to others. And it's also nascent. It's like acting like there's only one size fits all for anything is stupid. There's no technology that's really like that. And so we built in multi-chain self-custody wallet into every single Brave browser, and it's in the core browser code. So it's not turned on by default, but users have it there if they want it. And it's being in the core browser code. It's basically sandboxed from the outside too. So you get a lot of like security protection that you wouldn't get from an extension, where there's still cases now where there's a fake extension gets on an extension store and you start talking about people's funds. The privacy is a good primer for dealing with user funds, right? Like from a software perspective, because you are not going to hear a lot of the issues a lot of times because of the nature of finance. Like, people don't really feel comfortable airing their financial laundry in public. So you have to really figure out ways to like solve some addressable problems when you're building these things out. We're not there yet, right? I mean, every self-custody is in every Brave browser, but like the process needs to be cleaner and it needs to be easier. But what we started to do was look at things like a video conferencing piece of software that's kind of a Zoom competitor. It's called Brave Talk. It's in the browser. So we've added in Web3 functionality into that. So if you have an NFT on Solana or on Ethereum, we can basically like token gate conversations. You can pass off moderator access. You can sign in. We added sign in with Ethereum. We support in like crypto browser domains too. So like .sol or .ens or ENS addresses or unstoppable domains. And we've also integrated IPFS into the browser as well. So we've got all these pieces. Like, we really see Web3 as part of the bigger web in general, right? And the other interesting thing about last cycle is like metaverse as a meme blew up, but like really the metaverse is the web, right? And the user's agent is the browser. Like, technically browsers are called a user agent, right? And so that's the last line, like between you and the internet, really, is that browser. And so us building these things out and progressing them as pragmatically as we can on the practical business side, but also as radical as we can on the innovation side. That's a lot to balance, but like that's where we've been at with these things. And we think we can do it because last run we had neighbors saying, yeah, I could do this. The other thing was super interesting too. So I used to default to saying, okay, go to Coinbase to buy your crypto. And I'll walk you through that process. The last run, because Coinbase got so much bigger and their anti-fraud and other things, like the regulatory burden came on them, it actually became a lot harder Like I walked through with a retired aunt and uncle-in-law that wanted to buy. It took me 2.5 hours to get them from starting to actually buying something on Coinbase. And they could only buy $50 a week. And they're retired. They have money. They're established. It was really difficult. And then I ended up getting them. I was like, they're like, don't you guys, I saw an ad in Brave for your wallet. Can't I just buy it through your wallet? And I was like, oh yeah. Like I had just been mental modeled this out to where I'm like, self custody so hard. I'm not going to have them. I had them try in 20 minutes. They had bought from the browser directly. And they're types that are writing notes when they're next to their computer and have safes and things like that. They get it, right? So I think that the technology's been making progress. It's not 3 yet, but 2.5 is a good kind of way to approach it to get, because even getting fit in the market's hard with market participants. Like, and by framing it with 2.5, it's something people understand.
Yeah, I'm really glad you agree then. And I think one thing I've taken from the conversation is you've really nicely articulated this dichotomy from the huge value proposition of Web3, but also the misalignment of incentives of the Web2 world to getting it adopted, right? And I think the way you've described Brave is actually, it's very well positioned to realign the incentives and to actually put the companies and the creators as well and the individuals in the position where they actually can benefit from this technology much more easily. So I'm really, excited by that. I also really love the idea of Brave Talk. That sounds amazing. And I think there's all sorts of applications I can think of there for, micropayments, joining a Twitter space where you get someone to pay large micropayments, maybe to speak would be interesting. But, I feel like we could talk about some of these kind of more wacky use cases all day. We're coming to the end of the conversation though, Luke. So I want to ask you, I have to get your word on the future. So what are you most excited about to see this space in 5-10 years time?
Yeah, I think where I'd love to see it is where, and this is an area where we're trying to be a player in too, is like right now, this crypto space is often its own silo in a lot of ways compared to other types of payment methods and other even things like we're talking about token gating, right? Or accessing things like these are still siloed out. Like a wallet is a crypto wallet and you have a separate thing for all of your passwords and key phrases and all this stuff. And then you have a separate thing for all your payment methods that are traditional, right? Like I think that getting those things together in the same space in a wallet makes a lot of sense because like it should be where this all lives, and being in proximity of those things removes a lot of that. It demystifies it. And that's what you need to do for these things to get the scale that they need, because you're going to see people naturally will gravitate in a certain direction. And if they know where to go, they can get there. And so where I'm excited is to see like how that part of the process gets to see scale. And then I think if you look at things like the AI, right? A year ago, this stuff really exploded with ChatGPT. And a year later, you're seeing an interesting scenario where you have a lot of startups building tooling that need to start to show growth for their investors, but also you're starting to see use cases hitting the wild. With Taylor Swift was a great example where, okay, deep fakes are a very political season, like all these things where, if these Web3 things over here can help to authenticate whether something's real or not, or start to approach an ID landscape responsibly, it can be the one thing that might be able to actually crack the nut on making these things easier to like tell the difference of whether something's real or not. And so where that's going is going to be huge. I think that the other piece that's really been awesome to see too, and purists will hate me for saying this, but I think like seeing ETF adoption with crypto and what that does for the space, for visibility, even with Bitcoin being what the ETF's on, but now you're seeing other things popping up. I think that these are ways where you can start to get those second order effects of what has this done to my investment portfolio for my retirement, like where without me even having to touch any of it, right? Like it's going to do a bunch of things around, okay, if the markets are set up to speculate based on retail investors, which is what the original early stages of the crypto markets were. Like you could see it every time they buy the rumor, sell the news, and all of the bad players and stuff like that. But if you're in a situation now where ETFs are a thing and you've got institutional buyers making regular purchases, whether the market's up or down, it doesn't matter. It's on a more of an automated schedule. These things are how you get more stability in the markets too over time and more scale. And then how you like those people that are using the old methods of making money in crypto or moving the markets in certain ways are less important than they were, which is what badly needs to happen, right? Like I think it is depressing how many scams are out there. Those aren't going to go away, but like the reason why they work is because somebody can make a lot and then move things in a certain direction without too much effort to make it in their favor, right? And I think that these bigger things happening with institutions, and then the bigger potential around adoption, and with AI there's so much investment in the AI space right now, and these problems do not have a clear answer that doesn't involve mentioning crypto somewhere along the lines. Like, it's going to be really exciting to see these things come together. But if people are going to look for that tool, and the political arguments around this stuff fall apart, like on any type of inspection, right? To the point where it's just blatantly like you've got U.S. politicians that are holding up news articles that have been clearly debunked by other major players in the space. And you've actually got judges that are challenging regulators at the agency level that are being overzealous, and all of this stuff where I'm glad there are these checks and balances in place. I didn't expect it to come down to like old judges that are making these calls, but I'm really glad they're there. But I think that what this is doing, whether institutionals are getting on board or whether you're starting to see some signs of clarity around the enforcement and regulatory side of things, it's going to open the door to all this stuff being more freely open to use and to adopt. And I'm super excited about that. Plus, it's like banks and other institutions are also seeing the benefits of upgrading the technology too. And so you've seen there's like a ton of these CBDC pilots. I hate the notion of a CBDC personally, but the fact that these things are actually being taken seriously by these players is an indicator that like the technology itself is like what's the important thing is here. And these other things are just noise. And we've always, even to our own detriment at Brave, like we've always been heads down and building on this stuff because we've always seen the technology as what's going to deliver the value as opposed to like any short-term whatever. And that's to our own detriment. Like, the space does not reward projects that are serious about anything really. And it's not just us either. Look at what partners that Chainlink has gotten, right? Like, it was insane, and they're finally seeing some tailwinds, but it on the market side. But these markets are ridiculous, right? Like, you can't let them run you, or they're going to run you, right? And so I think like longer term, I think like getting this to become more widely adopted, just like how streaming is for media delivery. It went VCRs to DVDs to streaming. I think that's it's a leap like that, where like I don't need a bunch of peripheral things. I have it all working from my phone. I'm looking forward to that being what we sort of see rolling out over the next couple of years.
I love that. I really resonate with two of the answers you gave there. One, I think there's been maybe some downsides and some naysayers about the ETFs and kind of the focus on speculation over utility. But I think investment in this space generally does tend to feed into all the other projects, right, that do provide utility. And the regulatory clarity that's going to come by these big institutional players moving into space is going to be a boon for Web3, and specifically for utility projects based in Web3. And the other one you mentioned is obvious, and I knew you'd touch on it, is AI going forward and the need for provenance of content, accountability of bad actors, spam, deepfakes, all this kind of stuff. It's just going to be an absolute kind of perfect scenario for Web3 public blockchains and a lot of the things that it seems you're doing at Brave. And I'm really excited that you are already starting to thinking about addressing these problems because, like you say, the upcoming UX election, it's going to be a boon for deepfakes and AI and misinformation, and we're going to need to have solutions by the next election. And it's going to be really exciting to see what projects capitalize on that. So we are coming to the closing section now of this super informative and exciting episode. I've got two questions, Luke, that we like to ask across each episode to see how the answers vary between different industries, people, across time. The first one is, in one sentence, what is Web3 to you?
Web3 is about user first, about bringing control back to users, basically.
Bringing control back to users. Succinct. I liked it. That's really good. And the second one is a bit more open. If you could choose anyone, dead, alive, or fictitious, to discuss Web3 with, who would it be and why?
Who would it be? Let me think about that. Oh gosh, that's a good one. Wow. Who would I talk about Web3 with? I don't know. I'd like to talk to Ron Paul about it, to be honest. He's not dead, but be an interesting conversation.
And we can make that happen.
We'll hit him up for you.
That's a tough one because there's so many that come to mind that I could say, but yeah.
Cool. Thanks so much, Luke. It's been, as Alex said, such an interesting episode. I think this will be a really valuable one for everyone listening. So thanks again, Luke, for joining us. I hope it won't be the last time we have you on the podcast. And thanks to those listening, wherever you may be. Join us next time to untangle a little more of Web3.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Untangling Web3, produced by Emma Camilleri.
Don't forget to send us your thoughts, questions, and comments on social media, and be sure to follow us on your favourite podcast provider to catch the next episode. See you next time to untangle a little bit more of Web3.
The views we express here are our own and do not reflect the views of our employers.